The Daily Wire, Conservative Inc.'s biggest platform, which has thrived for years on promoting divisive content and conspiracy theories, seems to be coming to an inglorious end as it is sort of having an implosion. First with the firing of Candace Owens for abuse on Israel, then with mouthwash's critique of Texas governor executive order creating a safe space for Jewish students, to many of the toxic elements in the Daily Wire's audience taking a side with Candace Owens over Ben Shapiro while spewing anti-Semitic rhetoric, and now Ben Shapiro unwittingly making statements that amount to calling Jordan Peterson a shitty person.
You blame society, you don't have an answer. So it must be a conspiracy. There must be some sort, and you're just asking questions. You don't know, right? This is the game that is played by so many corrupt commentators, just asking questions. I don't have to show you evidence that something terrible is happening. I don't have to actually demonstrate how the thing is happening. I don't have to tell you who the problem is. Wink, wink. But I can just tell you right now that there is a problem. But even, and if I'm asked about it, hey, I'm just asking questions. Now, let me tell you something about just asking questions for a second. Just asking questions is a game for children. My son is 7. He can just ask questions. My daughter is 10. She can just ask questions. If you are 50 and you are just asking questions, I don't think you're just asking questions. I think that your level of curiosity is actually quite low. I think that you don't care enough to know or know enough to care. I think that the vast majority of people who are in the just asking questions business have an answer that they want to suggest, but they know there's no evidence for it. So instead they hide behind just asking questions. In other words, they're completely full of
Now, before you say Ben Shapiro wasn't talking about Jordan Peterson, you only have to listen to Jordan Peterson make the nobody knows such and such argument an uncountable number of times on an infinite number of topics.
I think it's pretty undeniable at this point that there is an impact on climate across the planet. I
think that's highly deniable. We have no idea what the impact is from. Yes, well, I also think it's an open question still to what degree Hitler's policies were right-wing versus left-wing, and no one's done the analysis properly yet to determine that.
Right, well, it's been happening for, 40 years? And things are deteriorating very rapidly at the moment in terms of the relationships between men and women. It's like we don't know if men and women can work together successfully.
Jordan Peterson's nobody knows shtick is the variant of the just asking questions phenomena, and we see that sprinkled in almost every conversation he has. Ben Shapiro made a number of valid points about just asking questions that I wholeheartedly agree with, because it's becoming increasingly common to see people, especially on the right, push certain narratives by pretending to be just asking questions. Perhaps the most mainstream and famous of them is Tucker Carlson, but Jordan Peterson is just as guilty of the just asking questions phenomena. For example, Jordan Peterson has peddled conspiracy theories on COVID, vaccines, climate change, and when he's called out on it, he invokes the nobody knows such and such as a defense. Peterson doesn't care enough to know, and he doesn't know enough to care about many of the things that he speaks about. It's almost as if Ben Shapiro listened to Jordan Peterson before making that video. Perhaps the most surprising thing about the descent of Jordan Peterson into some form of madness is the fact that he has gone full conspiracy theorist. While he used to maintain a semblance of a rational person just pushing back against the excesses of woke narratives, now he has gone mask off. He doesn't even pretend to be analytical anymore. He's been fully infected by the anti-woke mind virus to the point of him pushing a number of conspiracy theories, some of which came up in his recent conversation with Destiny.
I'm talking about the record temperatures that have been declared for like the past 5 years that have also increased with the concentration of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I'm not going to tell you that every model is perfect.
They're not perfect.
Now, sure, but right now we're like standing in traffic with our eyes closed saying the car hasn't hit me yet, so I don't think there's any coming. I think it's pretty undeniable at this point that there is an impact on climate across the planet. I
think that's highly deniable. We have no idea what the impact is from. We don't know where the carbon dioxide is from. We can't measure the warming of the oceans.
You know what's bloody interesting about what Peterson just said? With all the technological advancements and feats that mankind has achieved, for some reason when it comes to the climate, we happen to just not know anything. The human genome has been unraveled, but we have no idea what the impact of climate change is. Man has been sent to the moon and nanotechnology is revolutionizing medicine, but we have no idea where the carbon is coming from. We could traverse the globe in hours on a plane. The internet and smartphone has turned the world into one global village, but we can't measure the warming of the oceans. Who is this guy to say we don't know anything about climate change and its impact? I myself am agnostic about climate change and its impact. I genuinely don't know enough to make a judgment call, but I wouldn't dare proclaim my ignorance of not knowing enough as saying no one knows enough. There are people who actually study and do research on the climate. Does Peterson know any of this? This point ties neatly to the point Ben Shapiro made about the just asking questions people who do not know enough and do not care enough to know what they're talking about. Peterson doesn't know jack about the climate, but because he hates climate activists who are pesky and annoying, by the way, he decided to base his position on the climate in opposition to them and tries to justify his position with anti-woke rhetoric. The way Jordan Peterson speaks with such confidence about the climate change can only be attributable to delusions of grandeur. Another conspiracy that Peterson has famously pushed is that the COVID-19 pandemic was a fox pandemic and that COVID-19 vaccines were not actually vaccines.
Yes, fair enough. We did it on a scale and at a rate during the COVID pandemic, so-called pandemic, that was unparalleled. And the consequence of that was that we injected billions of people with an experimental, and it wasn't a bloody vaccine.
Of course
No, it wasn't.
Yes, it was.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
Peterson refers to a disease that has killed upwards of 7 million people worldwide since 2019 as so-called. Do you know how much of a psychopath you have to be that dismissive about the deaths of millions of people? Let's look at another classic example of Peterson using the just asking questions tactics as he postulates that COVID-19 vaccines were probably responsible for excess COVID deaths.
The mRNA technology, by wide recognition, is an extraordinarily novel technology. And
That doesn't make it not a vaccine, though.
Well, okay, it's a radically transformed form of vaccine. I don't give a damn. That still makes it something so new that the potential danger of its mass administration was highly probable to be at least or more dangerous than the thing that it was supposed to protect against. And we are seeing that in the excess deaths.
Absolutely not saying. So are you implying none of the excess deaths were caused by the vaccines? Or
I don't bloody well know what they're caused by.
Notice that when Destiny said, "Do you mean that the excess deaths were caused by the vaccines?" he responds with, "I don't bloody well know." Well, if you didn't know, why bloody speculate about it? Peterson poses it as, "I'm just asking questions. Who knows? Maybe the vaccines are responsible for the excess deaths. I didn't say they are. I'm just asking questions that maybe they are." But we all know that the idea Peterson wants to get out there is that the vaccines were responsible for the excess deaths. But he hides behind just asking questions for plausible deniability. Peterson's ignorance is perhaps easily detectable and put on full display when he comments on religion. Despite his many lectures on religion, Peterson is patently ignorant about religious philosophy and theology. He doesn't understand the basic tenets of Christianity and tends to mythologize concepts about it. He has his own conception of what religion, be it Christianity or Islam, are, that bear no correlation to what they are in practice. This is why he would define God like this.
You say you believe in God. You have been...
No, I say I act as if he exists.
You say what?
I say I act as if he exists,
okay,
which is a much more precise claim.
What in that? So, in what sense do you mean? What is the God that you act as though he, she, it exists?
Here's some propositions, and they're complicated, and they need to be unpacked. So I'm just going to read them, and that'll have to do for the time being. So, God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time, as the most real aspects of existence manifest themselves across the longest of time frames, but are not necessarily apprehensible as objects in the here and now. So what that means in some sense is that you have conceptions of reality built into your biological and metaphysical structure that are a consequence of processes of evolution that occurred over unbelievably vast expanses of time, and that structure your perception of reality in ways that it wouldn't be structured if you only lived for the amount of time that you're going to live. And that's also part of the problem of deriving values from facts, because you're evanescent and you can't derive the right values from the facts that portray themselves to you in your lifespan, which is why you have a biological structure that's like 3.5 billion years old. So God is that which eternally dies and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being and truth. That's a fundamental element of hero mythology. God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. That's another way of looking at it. God is what calls and what responds in the eternal call to adventure. God is the voice of conscience. God is the source of judgment and mercy and guilt. God is the future to which we make sacrifices and something akin to the transcendental repository of reputation. Here's a cool one if you're an evolutionary biologist. God is that which selects among men in the eternal hierarchy of men. So, men arrange themselves into hierarchies and then men rise in the hierarchy. And there's principles that are important that determine the probability of their rise, and those principles aren't tyrannical power. They're something like the ability to articulate truth and the ability to be competent and the ability to make appropriate moral judgments. And if you can do that in a given situation, then all the other men will vote you up the hierarchy, so to speak. That will radically increase your reproductive fitness, and the operation of that process across long expanses of time looks to me like it's codified in something like the notion of God the Father. It's also the same thing that makes men attractive to women, because women peel off the top of the male hierarchy, and the question is, what should be at the top of the hierarchy? And the answer right now is tyranny as part of the patriarchy, but the real answer is something more like the ability to use truthful speech in the service of, let's say, well-being. And so that's something that operates across tremendous expanses of time, and it plays a role in the selection for survival itself, which makes it a fundamental reality.
Despite the fact that no religious person ever conceptualizes or defines God in that manner. That is why he thinks that his letter to Muslims makes sense, because Shiites and Sunnis can simply put aside their century-old difference to fight the existential threats of wokeness. He doesn't know and doesn't care enough to know just how ignorant he is on these things. Many of Peterson's "we don't know" shtick is a cover for his actual position, which he subtly slides in and caveats with "we don't know" or "nobody knows." Peterson bots are able to pick up on that sleight of hand. They know what he's trying to say. They take his message and ignore the caveat he gives, only reverting to the caveat as a defense when their idol is called out on his position. For example, when Peterson claims that we don't know whether men and women could work together, that's him just revealing his misogyny. He'd rather women be in the kitchen and not work. But he can't just come out and say that. So instead, he says this.
It's been happening for 40 years? And things are deteriorating very rapidly at the moment in terms of the relationships between men and women. It's like we don't know if men and women can work together successfully.
But in what ways? Because
in the sexual harassment way.
Do you know just how idiotic this sounds? Just because men and women's working relationship is not perfect doesn't mean that we don't know whether men and women can work together, when literally millions of men and women have been working together every day without incident for decades.
What's the sensible thing for women to do about Me Too, to your mind, and what's the less sensible thing?
That's a hard question. It isn't obvious to me exactly what men and women have to do in the workplace to make that kind of sexual predation much less likely, with also subjecting themselves to restrictions on the sexual aspect of their existence that would be unbearable. It's very difficult.
If Peterson's proof that perhaps men and women can't work together is because of the Me Too movement, then he has to put the blame on the men who couldn't control their sexual urges in the workplace. Besides, by Peterson's logic, we don't actually know whether men and men can't work together, because there are lots of problems when men and men work together as well. We also don't know whether fathers can live with their daughters, because there have been cases of fathers sexually assaulting their daughters. We don't know whether men and women can stay married, or whether it's a good idea because of divorces. This is the level of idiocy being displayed by a so-called professor. Astonishing. Lastly on this, Peterson claims we don't know whether Hitler was right-wing or left-wing.
I guess because Hitler's lack of trying led him to kill less people than who ended up dying during the Great Leap Forward or during the industrialization of the Soviet
Yes, well, I also think it's an open question still to what degree Hitler's policies were right-wing versus left-wing, and no one's done the analysis properly yet to determine that.
Well, what do we
because
consider?
It was a national socialist movement for a reason, and the socialist part of it wasn't accidental.
Well, but
listen, the point Peterson is getting at here is him trying to institutionalize the right as having the morally superior position, because he's right-wing himself. He's mounting the defense of the right by saying, maybe Hitler was left-wing, and this tracks with his desire to blame everything wrong with society on the left. Peterson would not have a similar hesitation in calling Stalin or Mao as left-wing.
Well, one of the things I would have done if I would have been able to hang on to my professorship at the University of Toronto would have been to extract out a random sample of Nazi policies and strip them of markers of their origin and present them to a set of people with conservative or leftist beliefs and see who agreed with them more. And that analysis has never been done as far as I know, so we actually don't know.
How convenient that Peterson, the only person who could have done this research to determine whether Hitler was right-wing or left-wing, has been relieved from his academic position, despite him spending decades in academia when he could have done that research, but choose to wait until he's no longer in academia just so he can play the victim. I found the comment under a YouTube video that captures Peterson perfectly. It says, "If I don't know something, then no one knows anything. Jordan Peterson." So I agree with Ben Shapiro's statement. Those who engage in just asking questions are full of shit. Jordan Peterson is the king of just asking questions. He is just as full of shit. So yes, Ben, your buddy Peterson is full of shit. Make sure to tell him yourself.